You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Dana Peterson, Chief Economist and leader of the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board. I'm also your guest host for today's episode. Joining me today is Alex Heil, Senior Economist in the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board. He is also an expert in all things related to energy, infrastructure, and the environment. In today's conversation, we'll discuss not only the U.S. consumer confidence measure that was released for May, we'll also talk about energy and price changes. First, Alex will ask me about the May U.S. consumer confidence update, and after the break, I will ask Alex about recent changes in energy markets. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Dana. Thanks for having me today. So let's just jump right in. I think, everybody is keen to learn more about our recent release of consumer confidence. So tell us from a high-level perspective, what's the latest from the May 2026 release?
Sure. Well, consumer confidence dipped slightly in May relative to April. April was somewhat upwardly revised. But I would say that still the trend in consumer confidence is lower now than it was at the end of 2024. Looking at today's data, we see that the shocks from the Middle East conflict definitely are on consumers' minds, and it's also directing some of their actions.
Yeah, that's probably not surprising considering, consumers have a lot to deal with. So what about perceptions? Were those materially different compared to last month?
Actually, yes. Consumers were, I would say, less optimistic about the present situation. That includes the current business environment as well as labor market conditions. And when it came to expectations, they were a little bit more optimistic about the labor market and business conditions. But for the first time in a very long time, we saw a dip in their expectations for their incomes.
Right. Interesting. So if you just, unpack this just a little bit more in terms of overall confidence, what about what was driving change in overall confidence? The current conditions, the expectations, or a little bit of both?
I think it was more so the present situation or the current situation. As when I look at it on net, consumers believe that the current business environment is less optimistic for them. It's a little bit worse relative to April. And also the labor market conditions, which is a net number, but it's basically jobs easy to get minus jobs hard to get. So that is a differential, and that differential was worse in May relative to April. So that really drove things down. And also the expectations for incomes, which as I said, was a little bit surprising because despite all of what's been going on, consumers have consistently said that their incomes were fine. So this is something we need to watch going forward.
So Dana, let's look at one aspect of the report. So what about the labor market? How is that affecting some of this consumer, this perception of what's going on in the economy by consumers?
Absolutely. Many consumers are concerned about getting a new job now, or if they're let go and they need to find a new job, because we're still in this low hire, low fire environment. Companies are very uncertain, and they're not really sure what to do with their workforces. But that's actually a good thing because most people still are working, and most of what we hear about layoffs are in very specific sectors, mainly technology, finance, some retail, and also in transportation and warehousing. But for the most part, most companies are not letting people go. But when we look at the expectations measure, that was actually better. So many consumers are expecting kind of a parting of the clouds 6 months from now in terms of being concerned about the labor market.
That's a very interesting point you're making in terms of how that might change over time. So how does that translate to consumer incomes and finances?
While most consumers are working, and for many, their wage levels are elevated compared to, say, 5 or 10 years ago, it's all being eaten up by inflation. Real income growth is actually very weak. And how do we come up with real income growth? We take the wage and then we deflate that by, CPI or some other inflation measure, and that's slowing. And so we are seeing that against this, consumers are changing their behavior about what they spend, when they spend, and also if they're spending at all.
Right. Interesting. So one of the benefits of this report is it allows us to look at, some of the underlying details. So let's look at some of the details of the report. What about some of these, differences in confidence by demographic group? Let's start with age. What can we say about that?
Absolutely. Consumer confidence actually ticked up for persons between 35 and 54. That's kind of your core workforce right there. But among younger consumers, so people under 35, and older consumers, so people 55 and over, there was somewhat of a downtick. By income, confidence among higher income groups trended downward on a 6-month moving average basis.
Interesting. Is there any information we can derive about different generations in this group?
Yes, absolutely. By generation, confidence improved for the silent generation. So that's the oldest group, and that's my 102-year-old grandmother. She's still with us. So they remain the most optimistic in the month, relative to the other generations, which include the baby boomers, my parents, Gen X, that's me, Gen Y, Gen Z. So at least our eldest people are feeling good, but certainly we need to watch sentiments among the other generations. By political affiliation, it's still the case that Republicans are the most optimistic. But both Democrats and Republicans were a little less optimistic in May, while independents were the only group that saw confidence tick up on a month-over-month basis.
It's fascinating how much detailed information we can pull out of this report. So the last question, from the write-ins, what did consumers cite the most as having an impact on the economy?
Overall, consumers' write-in responses on factors affecting the economy continue to skew towards pessimism in May. We continue to see references to prices in oil and gas, and both of those increased in frequency of mentions for a second consecutive month. And also mentions of war, geopolitics, and conflict. It ticked down a little bit, but it was still extremely elevated. I think all of this is likely signaling customers' underlying concerns about the inflationary impacts of the war in the Middle East on their wallets.
Very interesting. Thank you, Dana.
We are going to take a short break and we will be right back to discuss the energy markets.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate the future of AI? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge from economics, marketing and communications, governance and sustainability, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Dana Peterson, Chief Economist and leader of the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board. Again, I'm joined by Alex Heil, Senior Economist in the Economy, Strategy, and Finance Center at the Conference Board. Welcome back, Alex.
Welcome back, Dana.
Let's jump right into it. Gas prices have surged by 50% since the start of the war in Iran, and that's also metastasized into other parts of the Middle East. So despite the U.S. being a net energy exporter, why are U.S. consumers still vulnerable to global oil disruptions?
Yeah, it's a very relevant question considering we've seen these price increases. And just to provide a little bit of background for our audience, every $1 increase in gasoline prices requires an additional expenditure by US households of roughly $350 million per day. So considering how long this situation has already lasted, this is turning into a real expenditure. And to your question, really the short answer is that oil prices are determined on global markets, and the refined products, gasoline, kerosene, jet fuel, in other words, other types of products, they are essentially derivatives of those global market prices. So if oil markets, see tightening and rising global prices, as a result of that, national energy prices also tend to go up. And that's what American consumers are dealing with.
Thanks, Alex. It's really interesting because many people in the US or consumers in the US believe that energy independence means insulation from global price shocks. What is the disconnect between producing more oil domestically and actually lowering prices at the pump?
Yeah, it's a very, very important distinction. And we are all aware how much of an energy exporting country the United States has become. But at the same time, you know, prices at the pump are a function of refineries pricing their product. And so when we're talking about crude oil, we also need to draw a distinction between heavy crude and light crude. Heavy crude is the type of product that historically was used for refining operations, that is usually sold at a little bit of a discount. Why is it sold as a discount? It's sold as a discount because the processing and refinement is a little bit more, it's a slightly lower cost. On the other hand, light crude is something that is literally thinner. Viscosity is greater, so it has actually, the of how liquid it is higher, and as a result of that, it's easier to process. The different two grades of oil, they are not used in equal shares at U.S. refineries. It's actually the case that heavy crude oil is used predominantly, and as a result of that, that's the one that is now driving these price changes. So, to your question on energy independence, a lot of the energy independence we've achieved with some of the shale oil production. Shale oil that is generated in some of the producing regions of the United States is largely light crude. So, it's not suitable for domestic, local refining of product. So, we are still dependent on bringing in heavy crude. A lot of it comes from Canada, but also from other countries, in order to provide US consumers with gasoline. So I realize that's a long-winded, complicated answer, but the market is quite nuanced when it comes to these two grades of crude oil and how they're used in the refining towards gasoline.
So basically, US refineries rely heavily on imported heavy crude oil, a lot of it from Canada, whereas we as a country are exporting lighter domestic crude. Given the fact that consumers are subject to the prices of heavy crude oil, is it true that the oil price rises like a rocket, but then falls like a feather? What does that mean? And why is it the case that prices will climb so quickly, but then take forever or a very long time to come back down?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly the dynamic that we're dealing with in energy markets, especially when it comes to gasoline. So in other words, we're importing heavy crude, we're exporting lighter crude blends from a national perspective, and that's in part the result of the investment that refineries have made pre-shale boom in this country. So there's a lot of refinery infrastructure and equipment that has, significant remaining life that is being fed by heavy crude blends, and as a result of that, that's what is determining, the prices and the cost and the flexibility of U.S. gasoline production, essentially. So, in terms of this old saying in the energy sector that prices rise like a rocket but fall like a feather, really we're talking about supply chains here. So there is a lot of There's a lot of volatility in energy prices. If you're on the retail side of the distribution of the product and you see the resource price, the crude oil price going up, refinery costs going up over time, or what you're buying the product for, those prices on the wholesale level go up, you're going to adjust your retail cost, your retail price that's facing the consumer accordingly. And you're going to do that in a way that you're going to catch up to those resource price changes immediately. And then some of the uncertainty in terms of what happens in global energy prices is going to cause some of these retailers to just simply tap on the brakes, no pun intended, but then basically to slow down the way that they are reducing the prices of their gasoline products going on. So what we're then finding is that in many cases, we're finding this pattern where retail prices, they rocket up very fast if there's a disturbance in energy market, and then it takes weeks and months sometimes. So that's also what we're expecting now with oil prices, depending on what the geopolitical outlook is, to slowly come back down, but that may not necessarily translate into falling gasoline prices right away.
Thanks, Alex. Since it seems like prices are at the pump are going to be pretty expensive, especially moving into the holiday season, how much do transportation policies contribute to higher gasoline prices? And what would happen if we could suspend some of those rules? Would it provide any real relief for consumers, but also businesses who have to fuel their trucks and trains and those kinds of things?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We're talking here about gasoline, but this all extends into diesel prices as well. So businesses are not shielded from this kind of price trend. The most impactful transportation policy, at least from an operational point of view, is probably the Jones Act, which is the legal requirement essentially for, in between port operations to be conducted within the United States by U.S. owned and operated vessels. So in other words, that limits and restricts the number of vessels that can transport oil and gasoline type products from one port in the United States, let's say the Gulf region, to other parts of the United States, let's say at the East Coast of the United States. So the Jones Act has been essentially been paused for the last several months in response to the energy crisis in the Middle East. So some of the price pressures as a result of this have been lessened a little bit, but it's also fair to say that while this law has impacts in terms of where some of the crude oil comes from and what is actually cheaper, relocating domestic crude from one part of the country to another, or just importing it from another part of the world. In the near term, these price, advantages that one can create by essentially managing around the Jones Act, they're not that meaningful considering how much of a price increase we've actually seen. So we're talking about a few cents on the price of a gasoline product per gallon. So that's at least what studies have shown. It makes a difference, but it's not going to change the entire situation that American consumers are faced with when it comes to gasoline purchases.
Thank you, Alex, again. So, looking into the summer driving season and beyond, what factors will determine whether gas prices stay above $4 per gallon? I know it's like $6, $7 in my neighborhood. And how long could the effects of this energy crisis last?
Yeah, I think it's all about, how quickly prices in Brent markets in particular are going to come back down. We've seen, depending on what currently the expected course forward is for the geopolitical environment, we're going to see some weakening of oil prices. And as a result of that, there's going to be less upward pressure on gasoline prices. But as we just discussed, these things don't get resolved from one day to the next. It's easily, imaginable that this is going to stretch through the summer and into the fall. It is likely that Americans, because during the summer driving season, we also see more demand than in other months of the year, and that pushes up prices as well. So we're going to see a tight demand and supply picture as a result of that elevated gasoline prices. Maybe we're not going to hit new records, but I think it's really like, think about it as a balloon that has a tiny little prick and we're slowly letting some of the air out. I think that's a fitting image here in terms of what energy prices are going to look like going into the late summer and into the fall.
Thank you, Alex. One last question. The US is not the only economy that's being impacted by the surge in gasoline prices, and certainly the war itself. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Europe or other economies that may be impacted positively or negatively?
Oh yeah, I think there are impacts and they are felt across the board. In pretty much all countries around the world. I think this in part there's different layers to this complex picture. So in some countries that derive most of their oil product from the Middle East directly, they're certainly seeing um, tightening of supplies and outright scarcity, and as a result of that, even rationing of energy as a result of that. In many of the developed world, you see prices going up, and it hasn't come to outright scarcity situations, but there certainly is a question of time, because ultimately what this war in the Middle East has done is taken 20% roughly of world oil production off the table. And so now all of a sudden that needs to be, replaced, substituted somehow. We're seeing, consumers in different parts of the world, especially where sensitivity is greater because they may not have financial means to respond to some of these higher prices, drive less, come up with solutions that is going to lessen the impact on their household budgets. And in the medium to longer term, you can probably also expect that consumers are going to look for alternatives that are less costly in times of high energy prices. Electric vehicle purchases are up in many parts of the world, and in direct response to high gasoline prices and high energy costs. So I would think that, while there are some countries that certainly have benefited because of their ability to sell their energy products at higher prices, if we're looking at consumers across the board, they're really struggling in many parts of the world, and that's something that is going to be the overriding narrative for really the year we're in.
Thank you, Alex. That was fascinating. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Dana.
And thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. I am Dana Peterson, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.